In this episode of Plants of the Gods, we continue our discussion between ethnobotanists Mark Plotkin and Brian Muraresku, author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Immortality Key. From ancient wine and beer to experiencing spirituality on a personal level, Muraresku and Dr. Plotkin ponder the role psychedelics have played in Western civilization in the second of a two-part episode.
There's a really interesting aspect to wine and beer that is often overlooked in these ongoing analyses, and that is that wine makes itself, but beer must be made. In other words, grapes that fall from a tree will ferment and create alcohol. Beer was not made by wheat by itself. It has to be made. So this shows that the path to these two drinks are fundamentally very different. And I think it just creates a different aspect to what's entailed not only in creating it, but in utilizing it. But that's a more detailed discussion for next time. So I'm curious, Brian, you've been incredibly successful at getting the church to be collaborative, if not cooperative, in the course of the research. And I'd like your take as to where the church is now, why they didn't burn you at the stake, and what the future looks like in terms of Christianity, in terms of Catholicism, in terms of all organized religions, as these substances become more widely used in medicine, religion, recreation, what have you.
Yeah, to be honest, I was more concerned about being burned at the stake of classical wisdom. Like I was really concerned about the reaction from some folks at Harvard, and Greg Naj in particular, who I reached out to around the corner here many years ago, the former director of Harvard's Center for Hellenic Studies. And I mean, in answer to your question, like from the very first conversation I had with Greg, sort of like the classicist of classicists, he was not shocked by this line of investigation, and he encouraged me from our very first meeting. And I mentioned that because I talked about this dichotomy between the classical pre-Christian scholars and then what happens in the seminary today. You're learning the same Greek. Why are there two different approaches to this? Why is there a classical department and why is there a department of theology? I think what unites those scholars today is this notion of a truth proposition, the value of truth. And so, I mean, the Catholic Church that I know, and I grew up Catholic, I went to Catholic school for 12 years, and I was trained by the Jesuits in Latin and Greek. So I only learned Latin and Greek through the Jesuits. Like, I was always taught to ask questions. And from the very beginning, when I was bouncing from an office in Boston to places at the Vatican, I would get the same response. So I talked to the archivists, I would talk to the archaeologists. The Vatican has an archaeological team, for those who don't know, the Pontifical Commission of Sacred Archaeology, which is a super cool title. And they're out there to preserve the remnants of Paleo-Christianity, to ask the same questions, I think, that I'm asking, and to arrive at this truth proposition. What happened? What motivated people to convert from the time-honored religion of their family, their ancestors, all these pagan cults? Like, what would motivate somebody to convert from that to Christianity at the end of the first century into the second and third centuries? Like before Constantine, this was an illegal thing, right? Christianity was illegal. It was literally underground, celebrated in house churches or necropolis, so graveyards. This is a graveyard religion. And today it still is, the interaction of the living and the dead that we celebrate at communion. And so I think that, as long as you're diplomatic and you be honest with the data, I think this is a conversation worth having, and I've never felt anything but welcome by the Vatican.
So what changed? I mean, Indians were burned at the stake for taking peyote and mushrooms by these same Christians or their antecedents. Witches were killed in Salem for presumably taking ergot. So why is everybody cool with this now? Is this something that happened 20 years ago, or has this been a gradual evolution?
I don't know. You asked about like the death and rebirth of Carl Ruck. So his career certainly changed from the late 70s to where it is today. And I wonder, the Vatican had its moment with Vatican II for the Catholics who are listening in the 1960s. And it's a big institution, maybe slow to change in certain respects. But there's always been pockets in the church, and I look to a lot of these brotherhoods, sisterhoods, like the Jesuits and the Dominicans and the Benedictines and the Franciscans. educated folks who have big questions, same as you and me. And I think the best of them, engage with the lay public. That's the mission. That's the ministry. Engage with universities. Engage with scholarship. Engage with divinity schools. So I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm not going to say that psychedelics are their favorite topic, but it's at least worthy of conversation.
Well, when I was sitting in Richard Schulte's class on the botany and chemistry of hallucinogens in 1977, I remember him putting up a diagram of mescaline, the mescaline molecule on the board. And he said, now right behind this classroom is the Harvard Divinity School. They worship divinities. Here is divinity worship by some of my indigenous colleagues and teachers. But the divinity school has never asked me to come over there and put one of these divinities on the blackboard. Now Harvard seems to be rediscovering what they actually discovered through William James well over a century ago. What's happening there now? You've been spending a lot of time there at the Divinity School, the medical school. It all seems to be coming together. So share your perspective on what's going on.
I'll share what I can. Yeah, there's lots of interest, and not just on that campus, but elsewhere. So I've had, the funnest part for me has been having these really cool conversations about the meaning of psychedelic studies, right? Writ large across all these campuses and in popular discourse. Again, things are very different from where they were even at Hopkins, 20 years ago when a lot of this clinical work began. So I've had the funnest conversations at Harvard and Yale and Hopkins and certainly on the West Coast. So I've mentioned a few of those psychedelic centers already, and where a lot of the focus has been on clinical work. Interestingly, at least for me, over the past couple of years as a humanist, I'm seeing interest in things like divinity studies and ethnobotany that you and I both love, and the social sciences and the things that William James was talking about at this weird intersection between philosophy, psychology, comparative religion. From James to the 1950s, again, when this was all fair game. I think that I sense kind of a return to the big questions. In addition to the relief of suffering, what do psychedelics really mean for people today? Why do people find meaning? Even if all you think about psychedelics are agents of relieving suffering for PTSD. Okay, if you've ever talked to, and I've talked to several of these special forces, Navy SEALs, who undergo these dramatic experiences with psychedelics, things like ibogaine and 5-MeO-DMT. The things they talk about, not in every case, but some of them have very weird transpersonal mystical experiences. Again, not across the board, but things that seem to tap into a collective understanding of the variety, like James, the variety of spiritual experiences that can sometimes happen under the right circumstances. And so, divinity schools are great places to host those conversations, English departments, maybe even in the arts. I think just I sense a real welcoming and an opening to what's really possible in the next chapter of the psychedelic conversation, which I think is that our deep history and this unwritten future.
Well, I regard the leading academic institution these days is the Institute at Johns Hopkins, which was set up in part by my friend Tim Ferriss and is helmed in large part by Roland Griffiths. And Griffiths famously has said that 75% of the people that go through some of his trials say it's the most ineffable, indescribable, unforgettable experience of their lives. It's very common in psychedelic experiences or reading about psychedelic experiences where people say that this was just a sensory overload, spiritually, physically, mentally. But in a recent conversation with Karen Armstrong, she talked about how many religions seek to empty us of everything.
Yeah.
And that they want to know how to get away from thinking about anything. This is the point of meditation. You want to get to the point where you've emptied your mind, your body, your spirit, so it can be refilled.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile these two things, where on the one hand you want to fill yourselves up with sensations from the ninth dimension, on the other hand you want to empty your soul at the same time? These would seem to be two completely opposite goals to have.
Right. And they are. That's why it's called a paradox. And I see you were citing my recent conversation with Karen. You can find it on YouTube called the God Paradox. I think paradox is a very good thing because I think that's, again, not ever having experienced them myself, it's one of the things that seems to occur in those who experience altered states of awareness under the influence of psychedelics. Distortions of time and space. Okay, that's one thing. You mentioned ineffability. That's another. But okay, so being part of yourself and also part of someone you're looking at or something you're looking at. So being here, but also there simultaneously. Now you're getting some pretty quantum mind-bending stuff. These are paradoxes. And I think, like a Zen koan, they're there to remind us that life isn't easily reducible. And I was getting my phone out because I did want to quote Roland Griffiths himself, who I think is going on the record about this now. One of the researchers who's largely responsible for the medicalization at least of psilocybin, and rigorous clinical research into these drugs. He said last week in a video address to the Horizons Conference at New York, he said that I've come to believe that this line of non-therapeutic research, what we're discussing, this non-therapeutic research is incredibly important and may ultimately prove to be crucial to the very survival of our species. So you don't want to be grandiose about this stuff, but Karen Armstrong said the same thing. And she wasn't talking about psychedelics. She was talking about these practices, these archaic, ancient practices, techniques of ecstasy in some cases that Eliade talks about, that just kind of bring us back down to the notion of our true self. So you can call it ego dissolution and boundary dissolving, but it's essentially like entering into meditation or contemplative practice or yoga, doing this stuff with the intention of losing the self, the false self of the ego, in order to find something that's maybe more genuine. So that, and here's the big, the whole point and the big kicker, is so that you can reinvest that sense of self into everyone you meet and everything you see. And so to be a beacon of love and compassion through these practices, that was kind of the whole point.
Well, I want to underscore something you said there, which is the importance of other modes of reaching these altered states. It ain't all about hallucinogens. In a conversation you had with Jordan Peterson, he said he'd come to believe that all of these religious experiences were based on psychedelics. I completely disagree. I think it's fasting. I think it may be mental illness in some cases. It could be meditation. So all of these roads lead towards a similar place. But as much as I appreciate the value of hallucinogens and entheogens and psychedelics, I don't think they have all the answers. In fact, I worry a bit that in some cases are being loved to death and sold, literally in some cases, as the cure-all for everything, the panacea for all of the world's ills. In fact, somebody sent me a horrifying link to something on the web called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, that some of the alt-right were taking these things to reinforce their beliefs, as noxious as they were, so that we have to be careful that these things are kept in perspective. Now, in your conversation with Karen Armstrong, you both quoted this wonderful line from St. Augustine, "If you think you've understood God, that ain't God." But it brought to mind a line of George Carlin's when he used to mess with the nuns in religious school on Sunday and would say, "If God is all-powerful, can he make a rock so big that even he can't lift it?" The point here being is that I think we need to find comfort in paradox. By the same token, we can't just dismiss all the stuff as ineffable and you can't know it and whatever, because it's part of human nature to want the answer, at least to seek the answer. It's an aspirational goal to learn and know, even if you don't reach the point where you know God or know the unknowable.
And maybe that's where psychedelics come in, right? And you're reminding me of a conversation I had with Glenn Shepard, who I'd love to talk about. Augustine said, "Si comprehendis non es Deus." Like if your rational mind can fix in on it, you're probably not right about God. And I mentioned this Jesuit Karl Rahner who said that we shouldn't even use the word God. It's all aspirational. The rational mind has a tough time attaching to this. But yes, psychedelics as, in the right way, these are not for everybody. I'm also super concerned about the public discourse and this notion of a panacea or a God pill. I think that under the right setting for, otherwise consenting adults, I don't know when that is. Maybe it begins at 35 or later because life is psychedelic enough. The infrequent occasional use of some of these compounds with people who know what the hell they're doing could be an aid to a spiritual discipline that then transcends or at least sublimates psychedelics into a life dedicated to contemplative practice and action, like acting on that practice to actually do something in the world, something of benefit. I mentioned Glenn Shepherd because he and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. Just shows you like how differently people think about psychedelics. And his estimate was that something like 50% of Amazonian shamanism, at least with respect to ayahuasca, is not dedicated to health and wellness the way we think about it. But he said they're hunting rituals, which I thought was fascinating. And he was talking about his work with the Machigenga, and all these hunting and why and how they use ayahuasca and other plants, other magical plants in these hunting rituals. And so I just think we have to remember that this medicalization that has captured the imagination over the past 20 years is just one very small aspect of what these things represent, how archaic they really are, stoned apes or not. These things, I'm talking about these plants and fungi, have been evolving for millions of years. And I think we always need to keep that in mind.
Well, my late friend Peter Gorman, who was formerly editor of High Times magazine, you see, ethnobotanists have friends in all sorts of strange cultures, not just the rainforest, was the second white man that I know of to take the magic frog, the green monkey frog of the Amazon. And he said that they were using this for hunting magic, and that he took it and he saw a crossing in the river with a big juicy tapir crossing it in his vision. And the next day, as he was hiking through the jungle with his indigenous guides, he recognized the crossing. And just as he recognized that was the crossing, a big juicy tapir came walking across. Wow. So this is part of the ineffable. You can explain this through the prism of Western science. But in one of your conversations with Carl Ruck, he quotes Carl Jung as saying, you can't reject something just because you can't understand it. And I think that's the attitude we should have towards psychedelics, towards religion, and in some ways towards life itself.
But can I ask you a question?
Fire away.
Because, I mean, talking about life itself. So, like, I mean, I look at you as a hero, as a groundbreaker, in a very real sense around this discipline and this topic. You know, as a disciple of Schultes, amongst other accolades we could list. I think that some of the most impressive stuff you've done is like transforming the insights you've had on psychedelics, or not, I don't know, or maybe it's through your scholarship or your study, into a desire to actually preserve these traditions. And what that means in some cases is preserving the plants themselves. Sometimes it means preserving the people. A lot of it has to do with very boring legal work, which is conserving land in places that's not always very easy. And if you wouldn't mind, like I think that you're an example of doing good in the world based on ineffable, mystical, otherworldly type encounters. Would you mind expounding on that?
Well, thank you for your kind words. First of all, I thought I was the one asking the questions here. But there's a Jewish concept called tikkun olam, which is about repairing the world. And I think that all of us live a better life in trying to do something a little better, helping somebody less fortunate. And it's not always possible. But if everybody sort of pitched in and try and make things a little better, I think we'd all be better off. And I call this the spiritual boomerang. You know, there's a small element of selfishness in the work I've been doing with my indigenous colleagues because it helps me. I sleep better when I see these forests on fire, when I see these people chased out of their traditional lands, knowing that I've at least tried to make a difference to help them and their forests and their frogs and their plants and their fungi. I feel like I used to say I'm trying to make the world a better place. I got too many dents in my fender now. Now I say I'm trying to make the world a less bad place. And I think that's a more worthy cause that hopefully everybody would try and do. But I've got to tell you that, I set out to do this and work on this and protect this. But on a few occasions when I've been sick, they've healed me. And that's the spiritual boomerang. You throw it away and it comes back to you. And if all of us can try and live our life trying to see where we can try and make a difference, what's the downside to that?
So what is ACT for those who don't know?
ACT is the Amazon Conservation Team. I'm the co-founder with my wife, Liliana Madrigal, a Costa Rica protected area specialist. And we were long concerned that rainforest protection was overlooking indigenous peoples and indigenous lands. When we started this almost 30 years ago, there were groups like the World Wildlife Fund where I worked that focused on protecting endangered species. There were groups like Cultural Survival focused on helping indigenous peoples, but they didn't work together. So we got together with an approach we call biocultural conservation to work in partnership with the indigenous peoples to help them, to empower them, to train them to better protect their land and their culture. They're in the driver's seat, not us. But we have access to tools, technology, training, legal expertise that can make a real difference, stuff they couldn't do on their own. But as an ethnobotanist, you know the indigenous peoples know a lot more stuff than you do about rainforest issues. But they need a helping hand. And Schultes often told me, he said, these naked people may not have a last name, may not have clothes, and may not be able to write their name, but they know a hell lot more about this stuff than we ever will. And that was a very humbling comment on him, and I heard it many times. So it's not about us playing Tarzan and saving the Indians of the jungle, but it's also not making a similar mistake, which is they can do it all. They know better than we do. Let's leave them alone. A similar dichotomy is where people say, well, we shouldn't give them iPads because that's going to ruin their culture. The other saying that let's give them iPads and iPhones and computers because that's going to save their culture. Neither is true. In Suriname, they say, to every complex question, there is an answer which is both simple and wrong. So I want to wind up here with a bit of a loaded question, which goes back to something we touched on, and that is the history of hallucinogens at Harvard, which is something which has been fascinating me for 40 years. Many people think that hallucinogens, and their study began with Leary and Alpert, God forbid, in the 60s. More of us in the know like to think it began with Schultes in the 30s and 40s. Those of us who've really dug deeper, like you and I have, know it began with William James prior to the turn of the century. But I'd like to know your perspective, having spent so much time at my old alma mater, as the contributions and the mistakes made by Leary and Alpert, which very few people address these days, where people continue to lionize them without calling attention to the pitfalls that they did fall into.
That is a loaded question. Yeah, it's... I haven't talked about this publicly yet, but Leary is still a bit of a four-letter word on campus. And, I just in generalities been having, I mentioned these conversations with folks from the divinity school to the law school to the medical school to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Just there's a lot of genuine organic interest in this topic. And I noticed over the past couple of years that, the specter of Leary, the shadow of Leary kind of hangs in the corner of every conversation. Because for those who don't know, the Pied Piper of psychedelic enlightenment, Mr. Leary, gets a lot of flack for what happened at Harvard in the early 1960s. And, when he and Dick Alpert, who became Ram Dass, were kicked off campus, that was the beginning of a long hiatus in these studies. So we're talking about, this is about 60 years. So from 1962 until where we sit today, it's been a full 60 years since some of this controversy erupted. But like we talked about at the very beginning, despite that psychic load, I think that the clinical work certainly made an impact. The fact that a guy named Michael Pollan teaches English at Harvard in the fall makes a difference, informs the conversation. And I think that people are reapproaching this topic now. I don't know why it's taken 60 years, but reapproaching it with a real sober lens. And it's been really interesting to witness.
Well, let me highlight the two things that I think live on in a positive way, and that's the work of hallucinogens with prisoners and with religious leaders, which, as you know, has been resuscitated and done in a much more rigorous and scientific way. So in that sense, that was a very positive contribution. But just like the Catholic Church that we discussed, some mistakes were made along the way. And now, hopefully, in the age of the immortality key, we're living in an age where we can learn from our past mistakes and not repeat them and look for a brighter future using hallucinogens in a careful, culturally sensitive, scientifically rigorous, and shamanic way for the benefit of all. But first and foremost, we have to benefit the people that taught us these compounds, the plants, the fungi, the animals, and make sure that benefits flow both ways. It can't be just about celebrating the use of ayahuasca while the original ayahuasca vines are being put to the torch, as is the case in much of the Northwest Amazon. So we live in a time where the candle's burning both ends. On the one hand, we have burning rainforests. We have indigenous peoples that continue to be forcibly missionized. On the other hand, we have the institutions of greater learning like Harvard, Yale, and Imperial College in London, and UCLA, and Johns Hopkins celebrating this back to the future, where these lessons of the ancients, these chemicals created 3 billion years ago, can revolutionize and improve the way we live our lives and our culture. And so I thank you, Brian, for your friendship, for your scholarship, and for being with us today.
Dr. Plotkin, you are a hero and a humanitarian. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, join Dr. Plotkin in a fascinating and insightful discussion about one of the most widely used mind-altering substances, tobacco.